Hey everyone, it's been a while since I've done one of these, and so I have a lot of things to talk about. I'm going to talk about 3 different things, including one thing that relates to what just happened last night. Last night in Washington State, Governor Inslee announced a change in the threshold, and this threshold involves data. So I'm going to talk about that, and we're going to move to more big picture things in parts 2 and 3. So in response to this threshold, the threshold is for the moving of the counties from phase 1 to phase 2. We have a 4-phase opening planned. And, we've been in phase 1 for about a month now. Counties were allowed to petition to move out of phase 1 into phase 2 if they met a certain threshold of cases. What that threshold was 10 cases, 10 new cases per 100,000 people per 14 days, over a 14-day period. And so I calculated out what that means. I took the 2019 population numbers. I assume these haven't changed too much. And then I calculated what new cases per day would be according to this threshold. And you see that the case numbers are pretty low. King County would require 16 cases per day new out of millions of people. Snohomish would require 6. However, yesterday at his press conference, Inslee announced that he was going to change the threshold. He technically didn't have to change anything because the threshold has always been for moving to phase 2 early. If you read these things carefully, which I do, then you'll see that that's the case, and that phase 2, moving to phase 2 on time, can be whatever they want it to be. When I first heard the number, I was like, that's low. I wasn't quite sure how low it was. And so that's what I calculated here. Yesterday, Inslee said that we can move to phase 2. Individual counties can move to phase 2 if they meet this 25 cases per 14 days threshold, normalized for the population. And this is, instead of 16, it's 40. Instead of 6, it's 15. It's 2.5 times higher. And so I've been collecting, every day I log on and I collect the data from King and Snohomish counties. By the way, Snohomish County does not collect data on the weekends. I do a linear interpolation to assume what the data would be for Snohomish on the weekends. Given that, you can see, we have pretty proportionate numbers between King and Snohomish. The blue line for King is about 4 times the orange line for Snohomish. And the King population is about 3 to 4 times the population of Snohomish. These two move in lockstep, and I've noticed that since the very beginning of this. The first case of community transmission in the U.S. was found within a couple of miles of the border between King and Snohomish County. So we know the virus doesn't recognize borders. The virus is moving back and forth between the counties. There's probably pretty good circulation, and we should consider the counties together as a similar hotspot. This has also helped me because I've been able to track Snohomish hospitalizations, and I've assumed that those have been like King County hospitalizations, which have not been reported in the same way. There's some quotes. There's a quote from the Swedish hospitals. They're a hospital system in Seattle, and one of their administrators said that they actually have about as much room in the hospitals as Snohomish appears to have from the data they've released. And so from all that, I think that it's pretty fair to say King and Snohomish are moving in lockstep. And so that allows us to say from this, okay, King has a lot more people, and so their threshold is going to be different. The old threshold was at 6 for Snohomish, and you see that that's below anything except for 1 day of data. 1 day of data, they reported 5. 2 days ago, they reported 5 new cases. Well, that's a good sign, but there's nowhere near 14 days of data. And the King example is the same kind of thing. If anything, it's a little bit more below. But again, they're pretty proportional. The 16 cases per day threshold is shown right there. But you can also see we're getting closer day by day, even with all the things that are going on, with the ways that people are opening up and moving around more than they used to be. This is working. So let's zoom in a little bit more because we want to see how the threshold relates and when the threshold has changed. This is just a zoomed in version of that graph. The King County line is now at 40. The Snohomish line is now at 15. And now you can see things look a little bit different. For the past 14 days, the average number of cases in Snohomish has been below 15. It's below the threshold as far as I've calculated it. And again, I'm counting 14 days because I'm counting the weekends. I'm doing linear interpolations. I've seen stories where journalists are going to go through and they say the last 14 days and they take the last 14 data points. But that's actually the last, 14 days plus 4. That's actually the last 18 days. And so you got to account for that when you're doing your calculations. The good news is, as a scientist, I'm used to using Excel to do these calculations. Don't tell anyone that I actually use Excel and not some kind of fancy other program. Because Excel works well enough, and I've learned how to use it. Like a QWERTY keyboard, I have learned how to use it, and so I don't want to change now. Snohomish appears to be below the new threshold. So they have actually already petitioned, even under the old threshold, they were petitioning to say, please let us move forward to phase 2. King County, the last 14 days, the average is here relative to the threshold, but you see how it's almost there, and if you look at the way the data is trending, this data is noisy, it goes up and down, but what you have right here, as you see for the last 4 days, now I'm literally cherry picking here, but it's 4 days, the last 4 days we've had an average that actually is well below the threshold. The last week we have not, the last 2 weeks we have not, as you see from that. But I conclude from that, Snohomish County is already meeting the new threshold. They should petition to move to phase 2. And actually, in my opinion, if they're moving, King County should move as well. We have viral diffusion, we have people diffusion, we have all these things going on. The people in King County should be treated the same as Snohomish County. And I believe they are meeting this threshold, even though when I first saw that threshold, I said that's way too stringent. We're actually almost there. With the new threshold especially, King County should meet it within another week. It sounds like things are going to be opening up, but the only problem with this now is now everybody's even more confused because King County's not going to be petitioning, but they're going to be opening some stuff up anyways. And okay, we'll figure it out. We'll muddle it through it. But really, honestly, did you ever expect anything else? What world were you living in? So I want to look at the data another way and say, how is Washington doing relative to the other states? And you know my drop-off graphs. I usually make my own, but in this case, I want to go to the original source of the drop-off graphs because they have a nice little tool, and you can go in and look at this tool yourself. Now here's all 50 states on the drop-off graph. Once again, northeast is bad. South is good. And you can watch the development of the epidemic in the individual state according to this. Obviously, you can't see much from this other than that New York, way up there to the northeast, is coming down rather nicely right now. They're not moving straight south, but they're definitely moving southeast. Okay, so I'm very happy with that. The other thing that we want to zoom in on is Washington. Here's the Washington drop-off graph. And this is confirmed cases. Deaths look a little better than this because it looks like we have cases that are developing and that don't necessarily develop into hospitalizations or cases at the same rate, or deaths at the same rate. But you see here, Washington has confirmed cases that are going sort of east. Again, neither good nor bad, but again, muddling along. And the other thing I want you to notice about Washington, moving east, and notice how much lower we are than most every other state in our region. You can see Rhode Island sticking out. You can see Connecticut that I've sort of followed over. And I believe Louisiana is also covered up by the pink thing. Michigan is doing okay as well. So you notice that out of the 50 states, we're probably in the top 10% as far as our progression through the wave of the disease as shown by the drop-off graph. So I believe this is further evidence. If anyone's ready to move on to phase 2, I believe we are. And I think King and Snohomish even look a little bit better. Washington's cases are going up because we have a particularly bad hotspot in Yakima, and we might have a few more in the state. The other counties are really looking okay. And so I firmly believe that Snohomish County and King County are ready to move to phase 2. I want to point out something else. Where did the threshold come from? Governor Inslee said it came from the CDC, and it does. It comes from this exact report that was about the thresholds for moving on to new cases. The 10 cases out of 100,000 people comes from the low incidence plateau defined by the CDC. But this low incidence plateau is not connected to the movement from phase to phase. It is another condition by which you can say that we're at low incidence. What's interesting about this is that they are very, they're trying to define what is a very low number of cases. And we're holding ourselves to this threshold. What is very low? Okay, the CDC says that this is very low, so we're going to say we have to be very low to move to phase 2. That sort of backed us into a corner, though, because when you look at the actual CDC recommendations for moving from phase to phase, the threshold actually says a defined downward trajectory over 14 days. We've had downward trajectories. Let's go back. We've had downward trajectories since the beginning of May. So we've been there for at least 4 weeks now. So I want to say that's the way it looks to me, and the further phases are also going to be downward trajectories. My only thing is, if we might not be able to sustain a downward trajectory if instead we are in a low incidence plateau already. According to the CDC recommendations, that is okay. We are at a low incidence plateau, which I believe can be interpreted as a near zero incidence of documented cases. But this is what we have to go on. So this is what we get when we move from science into law. And when you're making pronouncements, you're saying that the law has penalties associated with it, right? You're moving from science to law. And so you can't say, I'm just guided by the science. You are guided by the science toward the ends that you set with the thresholds that you define. All of that is data interpretation. It involves a lot of science, and you should do it as objectively as possible. But it's not just science. With that in mind, I think we're doing well. And so congratulations, Washington. I believe the data says you're ready to move on to phase 2. And I believe the data also says that you should be ready to move on to phase 3 fairly quickly, because we've had a long sustained decline. But I do believe also that we should wait and see. So let's wait a couple weeks. Let's see where we are. If things are flat, we're already good. So I'm not that ready to say that things flat is bad. Let's see what happens when we come to it. And the other times when I said let's see what happens as we come to it is the subject of part 2 that I'm going to get to next.